My name is Norah Hail. I'm 35 years old, and for most of my life, my family saw me as the quiet one, not the Ivy League graduate, not the luxury wedding bride, not the startup founder. They already had those roles filled. I was just Norah, the one who wore flats to family events, and still lived, as they believed, in a modest Portland duplex. At every gathering, they treated me like I was in a phase I hadn't grown out of, but I wasn't stuck. I was choosing something they couldn't comprehend: silence, privacy, and slow power, because while they chased validation, I was building something invisible, yet unshakable. The Ashcraft of family dinners were a study in subtle humiliation. Our gatherings weren't about bonding, they were exhibitions of status. Preston, my cousin, would always start. He'd casually drop lines about buying land near tech billionaires, or trading crypto with venture capital sharks. Cassandra would chime in next, always louder, always flashier. One time it was Tuscany, another time a villa in Mykonos, and tonight, as I sat in my usual spot by the fireplace, they were especially relentless. Their voices wrapped around the room like designer scarves, silky, expensive, and full of suffocation. I sipped iced tea, while they drank imported wine, and I listened while they tore through a performance of wealth and relevance. It was always performative. They didn't care what they owned, only who saw it. Every sentence had a currency tag, every story a name drop. I nodded occasionally, smiling softly, saying little. That's what they expected of me. That's what made me dangerous, because people always underestimate the one who speaks the least, and I had no intention of correcting them. Not yet. Eventually the attention turned to me. Aunt Evelyn was the first to strike, like clockwork. "You've been awfully quiet, Norah," she said, her pearls clutching her throat like they sensed what was coming. Preston leaned in with a look of feigned concern. "We were just wondering, are you still living in that cramped little place on Alder Street?" Cassandra raised an eyebrow. "The rental one, right? That's gotta be hard." I set down my glass and looked them each in the eye. "I like the space," I replied calmly. "It has character." Preston smirked. "Character? Come on, Norah. You're 35, it's time to buy something real." Evelyn nodded, piling on. "You can't live small forever, dear. This family has standards." I took a long breath, steady and unshaken. Their words didn't sting, they amused me, because Alder Street wasn't just my home, it was the first property in my portfolio, the first acquisition by West Pine Holdings, the real estate firm I quietly founded and solely own. To them, I was a struggling tenant. In truth, I was their landlord-in-waiting. So I let them laugh, I let them look at my thrifted cardigan, and my scuffed boots, and draw conclusions, because power that needs to be seen is fragile, and I wasn't interested in being seen, I was interested in being permanent, the kind of permanent that doesn't need applause to endure. I had no desire to win their game, I built my own, and soon they'd find out they weren't just losing, they were already living on my board. They loved to say we were a legacy family, that the Hales and Ashcrafts helped build the West Coast skyline, but what they meant was their names were on buildings their ancestors erected. I knew the real history. My great-grandfather was a craftsman, not a tycoon, a man who poured foundations with his hands and died with none of the buildings still in his name. Over time his work was swallowed by others, by greed, by sons who cared more about image than impact. They wore his name like a crown but couldn't even recall his blueprints. I remembered, I studied them, and I promised myself I'd make sure he wasn't forgotten, not with noise but with bricks, with restoration, not replication. My cousins were the kind of people who used the word philanthropy to excuse fraud. Cassandra once hosted a charity gala, where the food cost more than the funds raised. Preston bragged about using investor money to buy team bonding properties in the Hamptons. None of them had ever really built something, they only took spent, bragged, and worst of all they pitied me, because I drove an old Volvo and lived like a college grad. But what they didn't know was that I lived modestly by choice, because I was building something real. While they flaunted empty luxury, I quietly acquired income streams. I used to wonder if it was worth it, the loneliness, the invisibility, being overlooked year after year, watching them dominate every conversation while I stayed in the background. But the truth is, it gave me space. No one saw me coming because no one thought I was capable. That was my edge. When you aren't burdened with expectations, you have room to move in silence, room to observe, room to plan. I used every family dinner as a research opportunity. They thought they were flexing. I was just collecting data, weaknesses, habits, properties. I learned that Ashcraft Plaza, where these dinners were held every month, was privately held by a shell group my father and aunt managed through trust loopholes. I traced the LLCs, followed the paper trail, and realized it was vulnerable. Mortgages stacked like a Jenga tower, balloon payments, lapsed insurance. A whisper of audit could destroy it. That was when I started positioning West Pine. Quietly, patiently, I built the team. I registered it in Nevada. I hired lawyers who specialized in off-market acquisitions, and 1 month, while Cassandra was celebrating a second wedding, and Preston was too distracted by crypto losses, I acquired a controlling stake in Ashcraft Plaza. I didn't change the sign, I didn't announce anything, I let them keep their rituals, wine, gossip, financial preening, on my property, because this wasn't about revenge, it was about timing, and dignity, and legacy. I was never going to throw a drink in anyone's face or crash their vacations with a revelation. I was going to sit quietly at the table, until they started whispering about a mysterious buyer taking over their buildings, and when they finally asked for help, I'd be right there calm, composed, and holding all the keys they never knew I had. They always assumed the biggest threat came from loud men in tailored suits, not from the girl they ignored in a cardigan, but they were wrong. The audit had already been triggered, the board had been alerted, the rumors were circling, and as the meeting that night carried on, I watched the first cracks begin to appear in their foundation. All I had to do now was wait for the floor to shift beneath them, quietly. The first tremor came when Dad brought up business. That wasn't unusual. He liked to pontificate after dessert, pretending the room was a boardroom, and we were his protégés, but this time, his tone was different, tighter. "We've been hearing chatter," he said, swirling his wine, "about Westine Holdings, anonymous group, bought a major stake in Ashcraft Plaza, 6 months ago. Nobody knows who's behind it." My pulse didn't change. I took another sip of tea. Cassandra tilted her head, interested. Preston leaned forward like he'd just sniffed money in the air. "Has to be foreign," he said. "No one local moves that quietly." I wanted to laugh. Aunt Evelyn crossed her arms. "We should find out who they are. Whoever owns that stake now has board influence." I stayed quiet, watching them spiral. They were so sure of themselves, even in ignorance. They always assumed power belonged to people who looked and sounded like them. It never occurred to them that the silent observer in the room might be the very storm gathering outside. Dad looked at me briefly, then away. It didn't cross his mind. It never did. His daughter wasn't the type to shake empires. At best I was just nice. What they didn't know was that the new owner of Ashcraft Plaza wasn't just auditing the books, she was already preparing to gut the entire management system. Preston's creative borrowing from the maintenance fund, Cassandra's husband's bloated construction contracts, everything was being laid bare. The forensic accountants I hired uncovered a decade of indulgent fraud, all hidden behind fake vendor shells and misclassified expenses. I hadn't just exposed it, I'd prepared it for public release. My silence wasn't weakness, it was the countdown before a demolition. As they debated the mystery buyer, I quietly studied the space around me. The ashwood flooring my great-grandfather once laid was covered in imported rugs. The stonework he chiseled was hidden behind pretentious art. The building had been defaced in the name of modern luxury. I felt the sting not just for me, but for him. He'd built this with pride, they'd turned it into a showroom of their ego. But that was about to change. Ashcraft Plaza wasn't a trophy anymore. It was ground zero for reclamation, and I was coming to restore not just the property but the soul they stripped from it. Eventually Cassandra snapped back to me. "You work in real estate, right?" she asked, like she was suddenly interested. "You must have heard of West Pine." Her tone was sugar-laced curiosity, desperate to pivot. They were finally wondering if the invisible cousin had connections they could use. I smiled faintly. "I mostly handle small clients," I said. "Boutique stuff. Not this scale." Preston scoffed. "Then you're no help to us." I nodded, letting the words pass. They had no idea how much I was helping, just not in the way they imagined. They were still at the table, still laughing, still clinking glasses, but for the first time, I could see the panic beginning to peek out behind their polished exteriors. They could feel something shifting, something beyond their control, and soon it would collapse the entire stage they were performing on, not with fury, not with noise, but with undeniable, documented, strategic truth. I had built something real, and I was about to show them what happens when substance walks into a room full of spectacle. The night before the public release, I barely slept, not out of fear, but out of a stillness that comes right before something sacred unfolds. The statement had been reviewed, the audits finalized, and the board notifications scheduled. My assistant, Ela, had already printed and bound every financial discrepancy we'd discovered in Ashcraft Plaza. Pages and pages of false invoices, duplicated charges, family transfers disguised as expenses. It was all there, neatly labeled, cross-referenced, undeniable. I wasn't walking into a confrontation. I was walking into clarity, into the moment where silence ends and accountability begins. I arrived at my office early that morning, the real one, not the apartment on Alder Street, though I still lived there by choice. My headquarters sat atop one of Portland's most prestigious towers. West Pine Holdings had its own floor glass walls, restored timber beams, minimal elegance. I wore navy sharp lines, quiet power. Isla brought my cappuccino without speaking. We'd prepared for this moment for months. The Ashcraft board is assembled, she said quietly. Your family got there early. They're trying to charm the independents. I nodded once. Let them try. When I stepped into the boardroom at Ashcraft Plaza, the mood shifted. My father looked up first. His expression flickered, confusion, disbelief, then something deeper. Aunt Evelyn paled. Cassandra fidgeted with her phone. Preston's jaw set like concrete. Who are you? He said too loudly, trying to summon authority. I calmly placed my briefcase at the head of the table. Norah Hail, I said, founder and sole owner of West Pine Holdings, the company that now owns this building, and several others your family's been mismanaging. You could hear the oxygen leave the room. Cassandra blinked. But you, show apartments. I build legacies, I replied, and protect tenants you've been bleeding dry for years. I opened the briefcase and slid out the audit reports. One by one, I laid them across the table. Preston's illegal draw from the roof repair fund. Cassandra's husband's $300,000 invoice for $60,000 worth of work. Dad's backdated contracts. Evelyn's slush fund buried in client entertainment. Each page turned like a blade. Their empires weren't crumbling, they were being unmasked. Evelyn gasped. You would do this to your own family. You did this, I said evenly. I'm just the mirror you're finally forced to look into. Dad reached forward, voice breaking. Norah, sweetheart. I raised a hand. Save it. I gave you years of silence, years to change. You taught me that appearances matter more than substance, so I built something substantial, invisible to your kind of arrogance, until it couldn't be ignored. The board members looked stunned, shifting uneasily in their chairs. One cleared his throat and said, Miss Hale, what do you intend to do? I took my seat, not just at the table, but at the helm. Ashcraft Plaza will be restored, I said. No more shell contracts. No more creative accounting, no more family discounts. We do this right or I take everything to the authorities and the press. Your choice. Preston opened his mouth to argue, but Isla stepped in and passed around press releases already scheduled to go live in under an hour. Evelyn's hand trembled, Cassandra's face drained of all color. For the first time in years I didn't feel like an outsider in this family. I felt like the reckoning they never saw coming. You could feel the ground beneath them shift, but no one wanted to admit it. The smugness had drained from their voices, replaced with clipped silence and darting eyes. Preston looked like he might leap across the table, but he was frozen, held in place by something he'd never felt before, consequence. Cassandra picked at the edge of her manicure, her mind clearly racing to think of what was traceable to her name. Aunt Evelyn stared at me like I was a stranger when in truth, I had been the same woman all along. The only thing that had changed was their ability to see me. What do you want from us? My father finally asked, voice hollow. Money, shares, a position? I smiled. That was how they thought power worked, through titles, bribery, and handshakes behind closed doors. But I didn't want their empire. I didn't want a seat they'd carved out with arrogance. I wanted integrity. I want accountability. I said, I want this building and every other asset with your name attached to be operated with dignity. From this moment forward, West Pine sets the rules. Cassandra scoffed. You think the press will let this go quietly? They won't, I said, and I'm not asking them to. In fact, the first wave of headlines had already hit the real estate journals. Anonymous Portland firm unmasked. Norah Hail, CEO of West Pine Holdings, brings family empire under scrutiny. I saw the flicker of phones lighting up under the table. Panic vibrated in silence, but I didn't gloat. I had no need to rub salt into wounds. They'd sliced themselves. My presence was enough. The truth was enough. Watching them squirm wasn't satisfying, it was sad, because they'd had so many chances to walk another path, they just never looked at the quiet one beside them. You planned all this, Preston growled. You lied to us. You pretended to be poor. I looked directly at him. I never lied, I lived simply. You assumed poverty because you worship noise. I built wealth you couldn't see because I invested in people, preservation and purpose, not in parading status. Aunt Evelyn finally broke. You're destroying this family's reputation. I stood slowly, gathering the final audit documents. You destroyed it, I said. I'm restoring what's left. As I turned to leave, I paused at the door. Oh, and one more thing, I said, almost as an afterthought. The Alder Street property, the one you all joked about, it's not just mine. I bought the entire block, and no, I won't be tearing it down. I'm restoring it, like I'm restoring everything you nearly ruined. The room was still, not a word, not even a breath, because at that moment, they finally understood. I hadn't just outsmarted them, I had outgrown them. And as I stepped out of the boardroom, leaving behind generations of unchecked arrogance, I felt lighter. The truth was no longer a burden I had to carry, it was a weapon I had wielded, not to destroy but to rebuild, my way, quietly, completely, and on my terms. The aftermath unfolded like a quiet storm, steady, precise, and irreversible. Within days, the audit findings were circulating among key partners. Several board members of Ashcraft Plaza resigned quietly. Cassandra's husband's firm was dropped from all pending contracts. Preston's accounts were frozen pending review, and the family's once untouchable reputation in the Portland real estate circle was now under scrutiny. Not because I wanted to shame them, but because corruption left unchecked becomes tradition. I wasn't tearing down a legacy, I was cleaning it. What stunned them most wasn't the exposure, it was my restraint. I didn't give interviews, I didn't gloat in the headlines, I let the facts speak. I let the numbers speak. I let the silence they once mocked become the very force that corrected them. Meanwhile, West Pine Holdings soared in visibility. We were now known as the firm that brought ethics back into real estate. Our phone rang nonstop, not with applause but with opportunity. People wanted to work with us. People wanted to believe again that wealth could be principled. Cassandra tried to call. I let it ring. She sent flowers. I donated them to the local women's shelter. Preston posted some vague apology about miscommunication and generational misunderstandings online. It was pathetic. Aunt Evelyn went quiet. For once her calendar was empty. No board dinners, no charity galas. My father emailed me once, just a few words. I was wrong. I see that now. I didn't reply, not out of spite, but because there are some things words can't fix. Not after years of dismissal and erasure. Respect isn't granted by blood, it's earned by behavior. But not all the aftermath was bitter. Some of them grew. Cassandra, surprisingly, enrolled in a public university's real estate ethics course. She started volunteering at a transitional housing program. I didn't know people lived like that, she confessed to me once, later in a much humbler tone. I just didn't see. Now you do, I told her, and she nodded. I didn't need revenge. What I wanted was reformation, and sometimes that's the hardest victory to earn. Watching someone slowly become the person they never gave you credit for being. And Dad, he started coming by, slowly, unannounced. Sometimes just to sit, sometimes to ask questions. He'd look at the quarterly reports I let him see, and shake his head in awe. You really did all this, he said one day, by yourself, with a few good people, I corrected. He looked out at the Portland skyline, one I now partly owned, and sighed. I forgot what real building looked like, he murmured. You reminded me. That was enough. I didn't need a trophy, I didn't need a crown, I just needed a seat at my own table. I still lived on Alder Street, and I kept my cardigan, not because I needed to hide anymore, but because I didn't build this empire to escape my roots. I built it to honor them. Legacy isn't something you're born into, it's something you build brick by brick in silence if you must. And sometimes the best way to lead is not to rise above them, but to walk through the fire they lit for you and build a better home on the ashes. 6 months passed, and Ashcraft Plaza was thriving. Clean books, stable leases, renewed community trust. The grand chandelier they once installed using misallocated funds had been replaced with natural skylighting. The conference room now held free tenant legal clinics on Saturdays. West Pine didn't just manage the building, we returned it to the people it was meant to serve. For the first time in decades, the plaza wasn't just a status symbol. It was a heartbeat, and the tenants could feel it. They weren't being squeezed, they were being heard, and that was my revolution. I didn't attend another family meeting for a while, but one day, I received a plain white envelope. Inside was an invitation, a holiday courtyard gathering, tenants and family welcome. It was addressed from the Alder Street block, the same place they once mocked, only this time, it was Cassandra who had signed it. I showed up with a tray of cookies and a quiet heart. The courtyard buzzed with laughter and light. Children ran between potted evergreens. My tenants and my family sat side by side on folding chairs, sipping cocoa. For once the world felt as it should have always been, grounded, real, unpretentious. My mother found me near the fountain. No pearls, no judgment. Just jeans, a sweater and eyes that looked softer than I remembered. "This is beautiful," she said. "I didn't know you were creating all this." I nodded. "You weren't supposed to. Not until it was ready." She looked around. "I thought you disappeared, but you were just focused." "Sometimes," I said, "we have to vanish to reappear in power." She picked up a framed photo from the community table, a picture of my great-grandfather laying bricks in 1949. "He'd be proud of you," she said. "You remember what we forgot." That moment hit harder than any headline, because I wasn't just reclaiming buildings, I was restoring bloodline dignity. My great-grandfather's legacy had been hijacked by showmanship, but I'd returned it to craftsmanship, to quiet grit. The family didn't need to be destroyed, it needed to be humbled, and that's what West Pine had done. One project, one policy, one principled boundary at a time. We didn't burn down their house, we remodeled it with honest hands, and now they had to decide if they wanted to live in it, or be left behind. Later, Dad approached me, not with papers but with humility. "I want to learn," he said, "not to take over, just to understand." I handed him a folder. "Then start here with what a balanced sheet really looks like." He chuckled, but his hands were shaking. This wasn't about control anymore, it was about redemption, and he knew he had to earn it. That was the thing about legacy. It wasn't static, it evolved, and for the first time, he was choosing to evolve with it instead of exploiting it. As night fell, I stood alone under the courtyard lights. My tenants danced, my family listened. Portland breathed around us, the real Portland, not the one in their glossy brochures. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that's all I ever wanted to build. Something honest, something that could outlive me, something that would shelter hearts, not just egos. And standing there with my name no longer whispered, but respected, I finally felt the one thing I had never been given in that family peace. A few weeks later, I stood in the penthouse office of West Pine Holdings, watching the winter fog curl over the Portland skyline. Buildings I once walked past unnoticed, now stood under my stewardship. Alder Street, Ashcraft Plaza, a dozen more slated for restoration. I'd built this empire in silence, not to punish, not to prove, but to protect, to restore, to create, so that no one like my great-grandfather would ever be forgotten, so that no woman like me would ever be underestimated again. This wasn't revenge, it was legacy done right. Blah entered quietly, setting down a new acquisition report. "The city's Preservation Council just approved your plan for the old factory site," she said. "They're calling it the most human-focused development proposal they've ever seen." I smiled. That's the goal. My name had finally made its way into the circles that once ignored me, not through spectacle, but through substance. But I still rode the train sometimes, I still walked Alder Street, I still wore cardigans, because I never wanted to forget how it felt to be unseen. That invisibility became my armor, my access, my strategy. Aunt Evelyn sent a letter, not an apology, not entirely, but a note of recognition. A few lines scrawled in cursive. "We thought we were building walls to keep you out, but you were building a foundation to hold us all." It was the first time she'd acknowledged that what I'd done wasn't personal, it was structural, necessary. She hadn't changed overnight, but even the slightest bow from someone who never looked down was enough. I wasn't chasing their approval, I never had been. I had simply outgrown the box they kept trying to fit me in. I started mentoring young women, in real estate, especially the quiet ones. The ones who didn't speak in class, who didn't dress for headlines, who knew more than they let on. I told them, your silence isn't a weakness, it's a strategy. Let them laugh, let them underestimate you, just keep building, because one day they'd walk into a room like I did, and people who once pitied them would ask for a seat at their table, and when that happens, the goal isn't to shut them out, it's to build a better table. The final piece of the Ashcraft audit process wrapped with a new tenant advisory board. real voices from the community, making decisions for the building. I didn't need my family to like it, I just needed the people who lived there to feel seen. A child drew a picture of the courtyard and handed it to me. "This place feels like home now," she said. That was the only validation I ever truly needed. So if you've ever been the one laughed at, overlooked, labeled as less than, know this: you don't need permission to rise, you just need purpose. You don't need their attention, you need your vision. And when the moment comes, when the room finally quiets, and all eyes turn to you, don't raise your voice, raise your standard, and let the life you've built speak for itself. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, it's a legacy so real, it rewrites the ending.